Today we're going to be looking at the heart. So there are multiple parts to the cardiovascular system. It is a fairly long topic, so we're going to break this down into multiple videos. We'll also be covering the circulatory system over multiple weeks. Last week we started with the blood. So the function of the heart is to generate blood pressure and to create the flow of blood throughout the body. And so we separate the heart when we're looking at it into the pulmonary and systemic circulations. The blood is going to have both oxygenated and deoxygenated portions in it. We have valves along the way that's going to ensure that the flow is one way and that we don't mix the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So the pulmonary circuit is going to deal with the lungs. The systemic circuit is going to deal with the rest of the body. So we're constantly regulating the blood supply. It's going to change its contraction rate and force to match the metabolic needs of whatever area of the body it's delivering it to. So the heart beats a lot, 100,000 times a day or 135 million beats per year. So that ends up being a whole lot over a lifetime. So here we can see with the pulmonary circuit, you're going to have blood go from the heart to the lungs and then back to the body. The vessels that are going to carry the blood through the different circuits. So we have arteries that are going to carry blood away from the heart. Red and blue do not necessarily mean artery and vein. So red means oxygenated, blue means deoxygenated. So we can see here with the pulmonary arteries that they're going to be blue because they're going to carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs. It will pick up blood in or pick up oxygen in the lungs and then return back to the heart through the red pulmonary veins. So veins are going to return blood to the heart. For the systemic circuit, you're going to have red arteries carry the blood away from the heart to the tissues. It will drop off oxygen, and then it will return through the veins to the heart carrying blue deoxygenated blood. The capillaries are going to be where you have that exchange occur. So the heart is going to be approximately 12 centimeters long, 9 centimeters wide at the widest point. There is a little bit of variation in that person to person. So the average female heart weighs 250 grams. The average male heart is about 300 grams. It's going to sit in the mediastinum. So the location of the mediastinum is going to be between the sternum and the vertebral column, and then below the first rib, between the lungs and above the diaphragm. So it's basically right in the middle of your chest. The apex of the heart is at the tip of the left ventricle, and then the base is going to be the posterior surface. So your anterior surface is deep to the sternum and ribs, and then the inferior surface is between the apex and the right border. So your right border is going to face the right lung, left border is going to face the left lung. The heart is kind of an odd shape. So where we talk about its surfaces being anterior and inferior, it's because of the odd shape of it. And then it's got the right and left borders. So you can see here in this picture, it's almost kind of a pyramid shape, and it sits off center in the chest. So as we go through these notes, you're going to have several pictures of the heart as you go along. If there are some you like better that you want to enlarge, you're welcome to. You have these notes as a Word document so that you can modify them as you like when we go through them. These pictures here that are kind of a beige color are preserved hearts. The beige happens because of the formaldehyde. A heart in a living person is going to be far more red than what you see in these pictures. And then here, this is an example of a heart that's had the ventricles split open so you can see what the inside of it looks like. So your pericardium is going to be the membrane that surrounds and protects the heart. It's going to help to hold it in place, but still allow it to move. So you have the fibrous pericardium that is the tough, inelastic, dense, regular connective tissue. This prevents the heart from overstretching, as well as protecting it and helping to anchor it. So the serous pericardium, you've got the parietal layer that's going to be fused to the fibrous pericardium, and then the visceral portion that is going to be the epicardium that's actually attached to the heart itself. You're going to have pericardial fluid that is between the layers, and that's going to help to reduce the friction. That's a good thing, being that as long as you're alive, your heart is moving. So if we look at the heart wall, the external layer is the epicardium on the outside. It's serous pericardium, so it's smooth and slippery. The myocardium makes up about 95% of the heart. It's the muscular portion. It's striated like skeletal muscle, but cardiac muscle is going to have intercalated discs that make it a little bit different. Then the endocardium is the inner layer. It's going to be smooth as well. It will also be the same tissue that's going to fold on itself to form the valves, and then it will be continuous with the lining of the blood vessels as well. Cardiac tamponade is a condition when you have external fluid that will build up in the space around the heart. The problem with this is it can put pressure on the heart and prevent the pump from functioning normally. So we have 4 chambers to the heart. The right and left atria are the entry chambers. They're superior and posterior. They're going to receive blood that's being returned back to the heart. They mean entry halls. The auricles are going to be little spaces in there that are going to increase the capacity. The right and left ventricles, which mean little bellies, are the inferior chambers. These are going to pump blood into the arteries. So you can see on this picture, it's not as obvious as it is on some, but the left ventricle is thicker. This is important because the right ventricle pumps to the lungs. They're right next door. The left ventricle is going to pump to the whole body. It takes a whole lot more work to move the blood down to your fingers and toes than it does to move it just to the lungs next door. So your chordae tendineae are these tendinous fibers that are going to be attached to the AV valves. You've got the papillary muscle and trabeculae carnae, which are muscular projections in the inner wall of the ventricles that they will attach to, and then the pectinate muscles are the internal ridges of the myocardium in the atria and both of the auricles. So ventricles are high pressure pumps. The left is the higher of the two. It's going to have more pressure than the right because of the right only going to the lungs. The ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. On the outside, we've got sulci, which are grooves. They're going to have the coronary blood vessels as well as some fat in them. So your coronary or atrioventricular sulcus is going to encircle the heart. It's going to be the boundary between the atria and the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus marks the boundary between the ventricles on the anterior side, and then the posterior interventricular sulcus marks the boundary between the ventricles on the posterior side. So we've got a couple pictures here that you're able to see this. You can see the anterior interventricular sulcus, and then your posterior interventricular sulcus here. So again, you can see the anterior here on a picture of a real heart. So the right atrium is going to take blood that's being returned back to the heart. It's going to come in through the superior vena cava in the inferior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus. The inner atrial septum has the fossa ovalis, which is actually a remnant of the foramen ovale. We will talk more about that when we talk about fetal circulation. Blood is going to pass through the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve is also known as the right atrioventricular valve, so it will go from the right atrium into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to be on the anterior surface of the heart. So you've got those trabeculae carnae that are ridges formed by the cardiac muscle fibers. That tricuspid valve is connected to the chordae tendineae and papillary muscle. It's going to prevent it from opening backwards. And then you've got the interventricular septum between the ventricles. So blood's going to leave through the pulmonary valve, through the semilunar valve. And then it will go into the pulmonary trunk and the right and left pulmonary arteries. So you can see here it's going to come out. Here's the pulmonary trunk. And then you've got the left pulmonary artery branching off right here. And so another picture here, you've got the pulmonary trunk. So this is a transverse plane cut here of the heart, and you can see how much thicker the left ventricle is. So with the left atrium, it's about the same thickness as the right atrium. Both the atria are fairly thin. It's going to receive blood from the lungs and the pulmonary veins, and then it's going to go through the bicuspid valve, which is also known as the mitral valve or left atrioventricular valve, and move into the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is that thicker chamber that forms the apex. The chordae tendineae are going to be attached to papillary muscle. And then the blood will go through the aortic semilunar valve into the ascending aorta. Some of it is going to go into the coronary arteries, and then the remainder will go into the body. So during fetal life, you have the ductus arteriosus, which ends up being your foramen ovale, that will shunt blood from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta. It's a way of bypassing the lungs. This will close after birth, and you'll have a remnant called the ligament arteriosum. So that fossa ovalis is the depression in the right atria of the heart. It's at the level of the interatrial septum. So the wall between the right and left atrium, you'll have a remnant of a thin fibrous sheet that covered the foramen ovale during fetal development. The reason for this is during a fetus, the lungs are the last thing that really fully develops in a human, and they're not going to be taking in any oxygen until after you are born. So before you are born, all of the oxygen is going to come from the umbilical cord from the mother. So that's why we have a shunt, not sending it to the lungs for oxygenation when they don't have it yet. So the heart has a fibrous skeleton that's dense connective tissue. It helps give it its structural foundation. It gives something for the muscles to attach to. But it also acts as an electrical insulator between the atria and the ventricles, which is important to maintain the contraction cycle. This picture here is a cross-section, again, in the transverse plane that allows you to see where you've got the different valves in the heart. So your AV valves, or the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, are going to have 2 flaps in the bicuspid, 3 flaps in the tricuspid. So when the atria contracts, the ventricle is relaxed. The AV valves will open, the cusps are going to project down into the ventricle, the papillary muscles are going to relax, and the chordae tendineae are slack. This is going to allow blood to go from the atria into the ventricle. When the atria is relaxed and the ventricle contracts, the pressure is going to push those cusps upward again. Okay, so with the heart valves, I apologize for the interruption. We have the AV valves that are going to come open when you have when those are open, the atria are contracting, blood will flow down into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves are going to get pushed closed to prevent backflow of the blood. The chordae tendineae are going to prevent the valves from opening backwards like an umbrella turning inside out. So the semilunar valves, we've got the aortic and pulmonary valves. They're going to open when the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the arteries. So then as the ventricles relax, it will allow a little bit of backflow, but the blood fills the valve cuffs and closes them tightly. This is how blood is going to be passed to the coronary arteries. So there is no valves that guard the entrance to the atria. When it contracts, it compresses and closes the opening. So this is a top-down picture that shows where these different valves are. So when the ventricles relax, the pressure drops of the AV valves open, and blood can go from the atria to the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, it's going to push the valves close and prevent backflow. So this picture here nicely illustrates what's going on. When you have the AV valves open, blood is able to travel down this direction. When the AV valves are closed, the blood can't go back up. It pushes them closed. So nicely illustrates that. Here with the semilunar valves, when they're open, it's going to allow blood to go out into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. When they are closed, it's going to prevent blood from flowing back into the heart. So a little bit flows back, but it catches the valves and closes them. So with the systemic circuit, this is going to be the left side of the heart. It's going to take in oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then the blood will go through the heart and be ejected into the aorta and head out into the systemic arteries and arterioles. When it gets to the capillaries, at its final destination for delivering, it will drop off the oxygen and nutrients. And then those capillaries will also collect the blood back up and send it on its way to return through the venules and then the veins. And those will come back into the superior and inferior vena cava. And then from the heart, it will drain through the coronary sinus. So for the pulmonary circuit, this is going to be out the right side of the heart. It's going to go out through the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. You'll have gas exchange in the capillaries in the lungs, and then it's going to return through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. So for a visual, this picture shows nicely what goes on in that circuit. So the coronary circulation, this is going to be the heart muscle itself. The blood that's traveling through the heart through the pump is not actually going to give any nutrients to the heart muscle itself. Those are going to be separate vessels that will deliver this. So the heart is going to have arteries that encircle it like a crown. So when it's contracted, no blood flows into the heart. When it relaxes, blood will flow into it. So it will go from the aorta to the coronary arteries, deliver blood to the heart, and then return through the coronary veins into the right atrium. So the blue is showing the veins, the red is showing the arteries. This is a preserved heart that's had dye injected into some of the vessels so that you can see the arteries and veins. So looking at those coronary arteries and veins, you have on the left side the left coronary artery that will branch and give you the anterior interventricular artery that's going to supply the interventricular septum and the anterior walls of the ventricles. Then the circumflex artery is going to pass around the left side of the heart into the coronary sulcus. This supplies the left atrium and that posterior wall of that left ventricle. So the right coronary artery will branch into your posterior interventricular artery. That's going to supply that posterior wall of the ventricle. Then the marginal artery is going to supply the right atrium and ventricle. So when we look at the histology of cardiac muscle, the fibers are shorter and less circular than they are in skeletal muscle. Both are going to be striated, but the branching gives a stair-step appearance in cardiac muscle. They usually only have one centrally located nucleus. And then on the ends of the fibers, you've got the intercalated discs. Those will have desmosomes that hold them together as well as the gap junctions. This is what allows the action potential conduction to spread from one cell to the next, which is important for the heart to be an effective pump. So in the heart, mitochondria are larger and more numerous than they are in skeletal muscle, but it has the same arrangement of the actin and myosin. And this makes sense because you do have, the heart muscle needs to have good endurance. So your slow oxidative skeletal muscle fibers are the ones that are going to have more mitochondria and the better endurance. Heart needs to have even better endurance than the cardiac muscle, than the skeletal muscle. So when we look at the metabolism of cardiac muscle, lots of aerobic respiration. You're going to have a lot of myoglobin, glycogen in there, the large mitochondria. And so it can use fatty acids as fuel, glucose and ketones. And this helps it make it more fatigue resistant. So one of the properties is that it's going to have autorhythmicity. You've got specialized cardiac muscle fibers that are self-excitable, so they're repeatedly going to generate action potentials that will trigger the heart to contract. This is going to make a pacemaker, and form the conduction system. So we'll go into the conduction system in the next video.